Now, we have put in light that Ibn Khaldun did not see skin color as deterministic. But did he despise or have any kind of contempt towards black people nonetheless? In Ibn Khaldun's time, many were those, especially in Christian Europe, who believed that black people were black because they were cursed by God. That idea was one of the justifications for the enslavement of black peoples after the invasion of the Americas in the following centuries. As it is explained in another video, Ibn Khaldun took the time to debunk that claim, saying that black skin tone is not the result of a curse and white skin tone not the result of a blessing. He was very aware of the sheer ignorance from his contemporaries, including the most educated ones. Quote unquote. They declared all black inhabitants of the South to be descendants of Ham, the cursed son of Noah. They had misgivings about their color, and therefore undertook to report the aforementioned silly story. This is not so. End of quote. In fact, on top of not pulling all black peoples in the same bag, he seems to have particularly positive opinion about some of them. Quote unquote. In the middle of the first zone, in its fifth section, is the country of the Abyssinians, through which a river flows, towards the land of the Nuba. Many people have held fantastic opinions about it. End of quote. What Ibn Khaldun said about black peoples seems so offensive to our ears because we are projecting all the racist transatlantic slavery and the subsequent abuse, segregation, and colonialism that followed onto him. Whereas Ibn Khaldun does not think whites are superior to blacks at all. In fact, many of his work on black African nations come from direct interviews between himself and black African scholars. Quote unquote. I had an interview with Sheikh Suleiman, Faqih of Ghana, and one of its wisest and most learned men, by his science, his religion, and reputation. I have met him in Egypt, when he came with his family in 1397, with the intention to accomplish his Hajj in Mecca. End of quote. And here's a small excerpt of what he learned from him. Quote unquote. Black peoples comprise various races, peoples, and tribes. In the east, most well known as the Zenj, the Abyssinians, and the Nubians. In the west, Maghrebi traders penetrated in western black lands. They did not find kings more powerful as those of Ghana. They were the greatest black empire. Ghana, their capital, is mentioned by the geographer El-Idrisi. Later, people from Mali became more numerous and imposed their domination on the region. They were preaching Islam. Mansa Musa, son of Abu Bakr, was put to power. He was a virtuous man and a powerful king. Anecdotes about his fairness were narrated by many. He performed his Hajj in 1324. My friend, Al-Mu'ammar, was his close companion during his trip. He said, "We kept company with him until the capital of his kingdom. He wanted to have a beautifully designed audience room made of plaster. Such a building was an object of astonishment in his country. Abu Ishaq, a man with extremely skillful hands, put all his heart in building a square-shaped room with a dome on top of it, and added vivid colors to it. Mansa Musa was amazed, because in his country, architecture was something unknown. He, therefore, covered him with gold and gifts." End of quote. Plus, Ibn Khaldun's seemingly controversial remarks are definitely not limited to black people. Various populations were subject to similar comments, starting with the race he identified himself with, the Arabs, a population he ambivalently considered as savages. Quote unquote. The Arabs are a savage nation, fully accustomed to savagery and the things that cause it. Savagery has become their character and nature. They enjoy it, because it means freedom from authority and no subservience to leadership. Such a natural disposition is the negation and antithesis of civilization. The very nature of their existence is the negation of building, which is the basis of civilization. This is the case with them quite generally. Under the rule of the Arabs, the subjects live in a state of anarchy, without law. Anarchy destroys mankind and ruins civilization, since, as we have stated, the existence of a supreme authority is a natural quality of man. End of quote. It is clear that in Ibn Khaldun's mind, Arabs do not hold much value when they are not restrained by religious influence. Let's continue with the Slavs. Quote unquote. The Slavs' remoteness from being temperate produces in them a disposition and character similar to those of the dumb animals, and they become correspondingly remote from humanity. They are ignorant of prophecy and do not have a religious law, except for the small minority that lives near the temperate regions. That small minority includes Slavs, European Christians, and Turkish nations that have adopted Christianity. All the other inhabitants in the intemperate zones, in the south and in the north, are ignorant of all religion. All their conditions are remote from those of human beings and close to those of wild animals. End of quote. Those remarks about European peoples are remarkably similar to those he made about black Africans, dividing between those following religious law and those living in stateless paganism. He makes some remarks about their blonde hair, quote unquote. Something similar to black people in the first zone happens to the two corresponding zones in the north, the 7th and 6th zone. There, the sun is always on the horizon within the visual field of the human observer, or close to it. The heat, therefore, is weak in this region, and the cold severe in almost all seasons. Further consequences of the excessive cold are blue eyes, freckled skin, and blonde hair. Now that Ibn Khaldun's position is more clarified, here is a brief reminder about judging history and ancient thinkers. People need to be judged with respect of their moral of their own time. It is a usually dishonest intellectual practice to move today's moral standards back in time. It is not fair to say that some thinker centuries ago was racist, sexist, or any ist, along with its negative connotation, because moral values of their time were perceived differently. The social context was different, material conditions were different. People were not actively promoting an ideology. It was the way people and societies lived. This was part of the social landscape. That social landscape have dramatically changed when their material conditions have changed, with Western industrialization and the dramatic increase in economic productivity, output, and comfort. Perhaps things that we unanimously consider completely natural nowadays will be considered something ist in the future. And it will be unfair for future generations to throw that accusation on us. You cannot blame people for violating a rule they are not aware of, especially if that rule only gained mainstream recognition centuries after them. Rules are not retrospective. So, again, there is nothing wrong in pointing to an inequality at a certain time. But it is wrong to imply negative intentions on people living at that time and use modern accusatory language. Regarding Ibn Khaldun, on top of being wrong, that accusation of racism lies on wrong assumptions. Things that are obvious to you did not necessarily make sense to people before, because they did not have access to the information you have, even for a genius like Ibn Khaldun. Same applies for the notion of slavery. It is not a concept that is consistent over time. Can we compare an Ottoman janissary who was one of the most powerful figures of the Ottoman Empire and yet legally a slave to an African American slave picking cotton in Alabama? Saying both situations are comparable is just absurd. Sometimes things can be slavery in word but not in idea, and vice versa. Some things can be slavery in idea but not in word. Same for racism. Some people hate the name but not the idea. Plus, it is less than sure that you would have known better than people from 700 years ago if you had grown up in their world. So, although what Ibn Khaldun said might be debatable or questionable, it is nonetheless understandable and actually very logical from his point of view. Ibn Khaldun said what he said about black peoples because the first axiom of his theory is that humans are the same everywhere. Only environments and conditions change. It is already pretty outstanding that he doesn't believe in genetic distinctions between humans at all, and that he doesn't believe that people are not civilized by virtue of their race. Other major Maghrebi figures, like the explorer Ibn Battuta, also experienced cultural shock during their stay beyond the Sahara Desert. His prejudices were not directly tied with race, but with the failure of the local population to conduct themselves according to the normative standards of pious North African Muslims, because Islamic practices were, according to him, inappropriately combined with local customs, like the presence of naked female slaves in public. He was also disappointed by his reception by the local king, and showed some signs of contempt, quote unquote. I got up thinking that welcoming gifts from the king would be robes of honor and money. But behold, it was 3 loaves of bread, and a piece of beef fried in butter, and a gourd containing yogurt. When I saw it, I laughed, and was long astonished at their feeble intellect, and their respect for mean things." End of quote. It is true that there is an urgent need to rehabilitate Islamic, Arab, or Black history. But that does not mean that it must be idealized. All cultures have aspects of grandeur and aspects we find strange or backward. We're all irresistibly victims of the biases of our times. But blaming historical figures for racism does not add anything relevant or useful to the conversation. There was no internet, TV, or airplane at that time. A lot of information was unreliable second-hand chronicles. It was close to impossible to travel around, and immediately available information was limited. It can be amusing to read the astonishment of such a brilliant mind as Ibn Khaldun when he narrates the moment he saw a giraffe for the first time. Quote unquote. The king of Mali, Mansa Diatta, offered to the Moroccan Sultan Abu Salim a notable present. It was a tall animal, completely unknown in the Maghreb, called Zarafa. For a while, this animal was the topic of all conversations, because it shared similarities, characteristics, and qualities of various animal species at the same time. End of quote. If you were living at that time under the same environment and material conditions, would you have done any better? As a general rule, it is preferable to remember what a person meant rather than what a person literally said. There is a huge difference between the letter and the spirit of an idea, especially when that letter is not from Ibn Khaldun, but from his translation into another language. It is impossible for anyone to write a perfectly rationally argued theoretical work without a part that, out of context, can be transformed to appear totally absurd and become the object of sensationalism. Give me a few lines written by any man and I will find enough to get him hung. This video is meant to simply unfold Ibn Khaldun's thought, which cannot be summed up by mistranslated sentences taken out of context, that would obviously and rightfully be qualified as racist if they had been told by anyone today. It is also meant to make you think and reflect about the past and our own times, and make you think twice before judging a historical character with today's standards, because that would be unfair, ignorant at best, or dishonest at worst. The fascinating thing about history is that, just like a faraway place that would be exotic to us, people from the past are radically different from us, and yet they are still humans, just like we are. Was Ibn Khaldun a quote-unquote racist? According to his reflection on his Muqaddimah, no. Pretty much the opposite. Categorizing and generalizing is natural for humans, but it becomes wrong when that generalization is seen as definitive, preventing people from considering the fluidity of boundaries. Decontextualizing his approach would kill our understanding. But what if he was in fact quote-unquote racist? That would not change any single thing, because this is not what he should be remembered for. He should be remembered for many more significant things developed in other videos. His popularization of the concept of asabiya, group feeling, which he considers to be the engine of human history and dynasties. His methodology to debunk historical mistakes or lie, covered in another video. His unique history of the Maghreb, his dynasties and tribes. His coverage of disciplines that only took off several centuries later, like economics, sociology, etc. And finally, his theory about cycles of rise and fall of civilizations, as well as many other topics. If you enjoyed that video, don't hesitate to like it and spread it to people you think it would be beneficial to. Your constructive feedback and reflections are very welcome. Assalamu alaikum and see you next time, inshallah.